The wind swept across the empty plains of eastern Montana with a low, mournful howl that seemed to carry the weight of secrets long buried. In the small town of Miles City, population barely 6,000, the summer of 1987 had started like any other. Cattle ranches sprawling across the horizon, the Tongue River winding through the valley, and the familiar rhythm of life that had persisted unchanged for generations. The town sat in the southeastern corner of the state, where the prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by occasional buttes and the cottonwood trees that clustered along the riverbanks. Main Street consisted of 24 brick buildings erected in the early 1900s, their facades weathered by decades of harsh winters and scorching summers. The Olive Hotel still stood on the corner, its sign creaking in the wind, though most rooms remained empty except during the annual rodeo. Dr. Eleanor Marsh had arrived in Miles City 3 years earlier, in the autumn of 1984, a departure from her career at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston that had raised eyebrows among the local community. She was 42 years old then, tall and composed, with graying hair she kept pulled back in a severe bun. Her accent marked her immediately as an outsider, the clipped New England consonants that stood in sharp contrast to the drawn-out vowels of Montana speech. She ran the town's only medical clinic on Main Street, a modest 2-story brick building that stood between Holbrook's Bakery and the old Rialto Theatre, which had been converted into a hardware store in 1975. The clinic occupied the ground floor, while Eleanor kept a small office upstairs where she managed paperwork and occasionally allowed patients who needed privacy for difficult conversations. People trusted her, despite her outsider status, because she listened without judgment and because she never rushed anyone through an appointment, even when the waiting room filled with ranchers nursing injuries they'd hidden for weeks out of stubborn pride. She had a particular gift with children, speaking to them with genuine respect rather than condescension, which won over the mothers who'd initially been skeptical of the Eastern doctor who'd replaced old Doc Hendricks after his retirement. Before we continue with Eleanor's story, if you're enjoying this mystery, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more compelling true stories like this one. Now let's return to that fateful summer in Miles City. Eleanor lived alone in a white-clapboard house on Strevel Avenue, where the paved roads gave way to gravel and the manicured lawns of the town center transitioned into prairie grass and sagebrush. The house had belonged to a schoolteacher who'd moved to Billings, and Eleanor had bought it furnished, changing very little except to add bookshelves in nearly every room. Her neighbors, the Kowalski family, noted that she kept unusual hours, often reading late into the night with every light in the house blazing, visible from their kitchen window. She drove a burgundy 1984 Oldsmobile Delta 88, which she parked in the detached garage behind the house, and she could be seen most mornings at 6 o'clock, walking the 3 blocks to Main Street, carrying her medical bag and a thermos of coffee. She kept to herself outside of work hours, though she'd occasionally joined the other professionals in town, Robert Chen, the high school principal, Margaret Whitmore, who managed the First National Bank, Sheriff Thomas Brennan and his wife Susan, for dinner at the Horseshoe Cafe on Saturday evenings. These gatherings were informal, a way for the town's leadership to discuss community matters over chicken-fried steak and apple pie. Eleanor participated but rarely initiated conversation, preferring to listen and observe. When she did speak, her comments were thoughtful and measured, revealing an intelligence that sometimes made others uncomfortable. That summer of 1987, however, her colleagues noticed a change. Eleanor seemed preoccupied during conversations, her mind clearly elsewhere. She'd lose track of discussions midway through, her gaze drifting toward the window, and when someone would gently call her back to the present, she'd apologize with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. Margaret Whitmore mentioned to her husband that Eleanor looked exhausted, shadows deepening under her eyes week by week, and that she'd lost weight, her clothing hanging looser on her frame. The heat that summer was oppressive, even by Montana standards. Temperatures climbed into the high 90s day after day, and the Tongue River shrank to a sluggish trickle between exposed sandbars. The ranchers worried about their cattle and their hay crops, scanning the sky each morning for clouds that never appeared. In town, the few air conditioning units rattled in windows, struggling against the relentless sun. Eleanor's clinic saw a steady stream of elderly patients suffering from heat-related ailments, and she spent long hours ensuring they stayed hydrated and cool. On the evening of August 14th, a Friday, Eleanor left her clinic at 6 o'clock, as she always did. Mrs. Patricia Holbrook, who ran the bakery next door and who lived in the apartment above her shop, saw Eleanor lock the front door and walk to her Oldsmobile parked on the street. Patricia would later tell investigators that Eleanor had looked tired, shadows under her eyes darker than usual, but otherwise normal. She wore her typical work attire, a white blouse, navy skirt, and her medical jacket with her name embroidered on the pocket. She carried her medical bag in her left hand and her purse in her right. Patricia called out a goodbye, and Eleanor waved but didn't stop to chat as she sometimes did. She got into her car, started the engine, and drove away, heading west on Main Street, towards Strevel Avenue and her house 3 blocks away. She never arrived. Eleanor's absence wasn't immediately noticed. She had no family in Miles City, no standing Friday evening plans that would be disrupted by her failure to appear. It wasn't until nearly midnight, when she didn't answer her weekly phone call from her sister Catherine, who lived in Northampton, Massachusetts, that anyone realized something might be wrong. Catherine tried calling 3 times over the course of an hour, letting the phone ring a dozen times each attempt. Eleanor was punctual about their Friday calls, had been since moving to Montana, and in 3 years she'd never missed one without calling ahead to reschedule. Concerned, Catherine called the Miles City Police Department, reaching the night dispatcher, who transferred her to Sheriff Brennan's home number. The sheriff, a weathered man in his late 50s with a handlebar mustache and a reputation for thoroughness, listened to Catherine's concerns with growing unease. He'd known Eleanor long enough to recognize that she was a creature of habit, someone who valued routine and reliability. He told Catherine he'd check on her immediately. Sheriff Brennan drove to Eleanor's house himself, his headlights cutting through the darkness as he turned onto Strevel Avenue. The house was completely dark, not a single light visible through any window. Her burgundy Oldsmobile wasn't in the driveway or visible on the street. He parked and approached the front door, knocking firmly and calling out Eleanor's name. No response came from inside. He tried the door and found it locked. Walking around the property with his flashlight, he checked each window, all locked, curtains drawn. The back door was also secured. Using the spare key Eleanor had given him months earlier, after she'd locked herself out following a house call, Sheriff Brennan let himself inside. The house was still, untouched, preserved exactly as Eleanor must have left it that morning. In the kitchen, clean dishes sat in the drainer beside the sink, a coffee mug rinsed and turned upside down. The morning newspaper lay on the kitchen table, folded open to the crossword puzzle, partially completed in Eleanor's precise handwriting. Her medical bag sat on the counter by the back door, the spare one she kept at home, not the one she carried to work. The refrigerator hummed quietly. Everything appeared normal, orderly, except for Eleanor's absence. Sheriff Brennan checked the bedroom. The bed was made with hospital corners, the way Eleanor always left it. Her closet contained her limited wardrobe, organized by type and color, The bathroom showed signs of morning use, a damp towel hanging on the rack, toothbrush in its holder. Nothing suggested a struggle, a hasty departure, or foul play. It was as if Eleanor had simply vanished between her clinic and her home, a distance of 3 blocks through the heart of Miles City. The sheriff returned to his car and radioed his deputy, Jim Morrison, who was patrolling the northern part of the county. He instructed Jim to begin checking the route between the clinic and Eleanor's house and to alert the state highway patrol to watch for her vehicle. Then he drove back to the clinic, using Eleanor's key to let himself inside. The clinic was as orderly as her home. Patient files were properly stored, the examination rooms clean and ready for Monday morning. Her desk in the upstairs office revealed nothing unusual. Appointment book, medical journals, a framed photograph of Eleanor with an older woman who Sheriff Brennan assumed was her mother. By 3 in the morning, with no sign of Eleanor or her car, Sheriff Brennan called Catherine back. Her voice was tight with worry as he explained what he'd found, or rather, what he hadn't found. Catherine provided background information. Eleanor was a widow, her husband having died in 1979. She had no children. She'd left Boston abruptly in 1984 after resigning from the hospital without explanation. She was methodical and careful, not prone to impulsive decisions or unexplained absences. As dawn broke over Miles City, painting the prairie in shades of pink and gold, Sheriff Brennan organized a search. By 8 o'clock, 20 volunteers had gathered at the courthouse, ranchers, shop owners, county employees, anyone who could be spared for a few hours. He divided them into teams, assigning each a grid of roads to check, focusing first on the direct routes out of town, and then expanding to the ranch roads and 2 tracks that webbed across the countryside. The State Highway Patrol sent additional officers. Someone contacted the Civil Air Patrol, and by noon, a small plane was circling overhead, the pilot scanning the landscape for any sign of the burgundy Oldsmobile. The search continued through Saturday with increasing desperation. Miles City was small enough that everyone knew Dr. Marsh by sight, if not personally, and her disappearance sent ripples of anxiety through the community. People gathered in small groups outside the post office and the grocery store, sharing theories and fears. Some suggested she might have had a medical emergency while driving, causing her to veer off the road into one of the deep coulees that scarred the landscape. Others wondered if she'd simply decided to leave, to return to the East Coast without warning, though this seemed inconsistent with everything anyone knew about her character. Patricia Holbrook provided detailed information to investigators. She'd been sitting by her window Friday evening, waiting for the dinner-hour heat to dissipate before cooking her meal when she'd seen Eleanor leave the clinic. Patricia had watched her walk to her car, noting nothing unusual about her movements or demeanor. Eleanor had driven west on Main Street as expected, but Patricia hadn't kept watching. She'd turned back to her magazine, thinking nothing more of it. Now she replayed those moments obsessively, wondering if she'd missed some crucial detail, some sign of the disaster that was about to unfold. Sheriff Brennan interviewed Eleanor's patients from that final day. 7 people had appointments on Friday. 3 routine checkups, 2 follow-ups for chronic conditions, 1 teenager with a sprained ankle, and 1 new patient, a man named David Garrett, who'd registered giving an address from Forsyth, a town 60 miles west. The receptionist, Linda Hayes, who worked mornings at the clinic, remembered Garrett because he'd paid in cash and had been vague about his insurance information. He'd complained of persistent headaches, and Eleanor had examined him for 20 minutes before prescribing medication and recommending follow-up testing in Billings. Linda described him as unremarkable, average height, brown hair, probably in his 40s, wearing jeans and a work shirt. She'd filed his intake paperwork in the new patient folder. When Sheriff Brennan tried to follow up with David Garrett, he found the address in Forsyth didn't exist. The street name was real, but the house number wasn't. The phone number on the intake form connected to a gas station in Coldstrip that had no knowledge of anyone named Garrett. This discovery elevated the investigation's urgency. Eleanor's disappearance might not be random or accidental. It might be connected to this mysterious patient who'd provided false information. Sunday brought no breakthroughs. The search expanded to a 50-mile radius, encompassing thousands of acres of ranch land, badlands, and broken country, where a vehicle could disappear into a ravine and remain hidden for years. Volunteers on horseback covered areas inaccessible by car, following cattle trails and dry creek beds. The August heat was punishing, and by afternoon, several searchers had been treated for dehydration and heat exhaustion. Sheriff Brennan set up a command post in the courthouse basement, where a large county map was pinned to the wall, sections marked off as they were searched. The state investigators arrived Monday morning, Detective Sarah Vaughn and Detective Michael Reeves, both from the Montana Department of Criminal Investigation in Helena. They were experienced, methodical, and they brought resources that Sheriff Brennan's small department lacked: forensic capabilities, access to statewide databases, connections to federal agencies if needed. Detective Vaughn was in her mid-30s, compact and intense, with short dark hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Detective Reeves was older, maybe 50, with the patient demeanor of someone who'd worked hundreds of cases and understood that answers rarely came quickly. They began by retracing Eleanor's last known hours in minute detail. They interviewed Patricia Holbrook again, asking her to close her eyes and visualize exactly what she'd seen. Was Eleanor carrying anything besides her medical bag and purse? No. Did she seem to be in a hurry? No. Her pace was normal. Did any other vehicles pass by at that time? Patricia thought hard. Yes, a pickup truck heading east, maybe Stan Larson's Ford, but she couldn't be certain. Did Eleanor look at anyone or wave to anyone besides Patricia? No. She'd gotten directly into her car and driven away. The detectives examined Eleanor's house with forensic precision, dusting for fingerprints, searching for anything that might explain her disappearance. In her bedroom closet, hidden behind a stack of sweaters on the top shelf, they found a locked metal box. Sheriff Brennan helped them force it open. Inside were letters, dozens of them, dating back 6 months to February 1987. They were all postmarked from different Montana towns: Billings, Great Falls, Glendive, Havre, Butte. Each envelope was addressed to Dr. Eleanor Marsh in careful block printing. The letters themselves were brief, cryptic, and increasingly menacing in tone. The first letter, dated February 10th, read, "Dr. Marsh, I know what you did. The past doesn't stay buried forever." The second, from March 3rd, was similar. "You thought you could run away and start over. You were wrong." Subsequent letters referenced debts that must be paid, and justice that will be served, and the truth that will be revealed. None were signed. None provided specific details about what Eleanor had allegedly done. The most recent letter, received in late July, contained just one sentence: "I'm coming for you soon." Detective Vaughn photographed each letter and envelope, then sent them to the state crime lab for analysis. The paper was standard typing paper available at any office supply store. The envelopes were generic. The block printing was distinctive, carefully executed to avoid revealing the writer's natural handwriting, but a forensic document examiner might be able to extract useful information about the writer's education level, habits, and possible psychological state. Sheriff Brennan was furious that Eleanor hadn't reported these threatening letters. Detective Reeves suggested that she might have had reasons to avoid police involvement. Perhaps the letters referenced something from her past that she wanted to keep hidden, something she'd been running from when she'd left Boston. This theory was supported by what they discovered next. Eleanor had legally changed her name in 1979, shortly after her husband's death. Her married name had been Eleanor Whitfield, Before that, she'd been Eleanor Ann Marsh. The name change had been processed through Massachusetts courts, and the reason listed was simply personal preference. The detectives contacted Eleanor's sister, Catherine, who lived in Northampton and worked as a librarian at Smith College. Catherine was devastated by her sister's disappearance and anxious to help in any way possible. Over the phone, with Detective Vaughan taking detailed notes, Catherine provided context that began to reshape the investigation. Eleanor had been married to Dr. James Whitfield, a neuroscience researcher at Albany Medical College in upstate New York. James had been brilliant but troubled, Catherine explained, prone to obsessive work habits and periods of deep depression. Eleanor had worked as a psychiatric nurse at Capital District Psychiatric Center in Albany, where she'd specialized in trauma patients. James's research had focused on memory formation and suppression in PTSD patients, controversial work that pushed ethical boundaries. In 1979, James had died in a single-car accident on a rural road outside Albany, his vehicle leaving the road at high speed and striking a tree. The investigation had ruled it an accident, though Catherine admitted the family had suspected suicide. After James's death, Eleanor had changed her name back to Marsh and moved to Boston, seeking a fresh start. She'd worked at Massachusetts General Hospital for 5 years, slowly rebuilding her life before abruptly resigning in 1984 and moving to Montana. Catherine didn't know why Eleanor had left Boston so suddenly. Her sister had been evasive when asked, saying only that she needed distance and quiet. Catherine had assumed Eleanor was still processing grief, but now she wondered if something else had driven her sister to such an isolated location. Detective Vaughan asked if Eleanor had ever mentioned being followed or harassed in Boston. Catherine hesitated, then admitted that Eleanor had mentioned feeling watched during her last months in Massachusetts, catching glimpses of the same person multiple times in different locations. A man in a dark coat, average build, who always vanished when she tried to get a closer look. Eleanor had dismissed it as paranoia, stress from the demands of her job, but Catherine had worried about her sister's mental state. Tuesday brought the breakthrough in the vehicle search. A rancher named Carl Dietrich, whose property sprawled across 20,000 acres northeast of Miles City, called the sheriff's office to report finding a car on one of his remote sections. It was burgundy, an Oldsmobile, hidden partially behind an old homestead building that had been abandoned since the 1950s. The location was approximately 15 miles from town, accessed by a series of increasingly rough dirt roads that eventually became little more than 2-track trails through sagebrush and rocky soil. Sheriff Brennan, Detectives Vaughan and Reeves, and a team of deputies and state crime scene technicians drove out to the Dietrich Ranch immediately. The August afternoon was scorching, heat waves shimmering off the prairie, grasshoppers exploding from the dried grass with each step. The abandoned homestead consisted of a collapsed barn, a house with no roof, and various outbuildings in various states of decay. Eleanor's Oldsmobile was parked behind what had once been a chicken coop, positioned so it couldn't be seen from the main road, though main road was a generous description of the rutted track that passed for access. The car's doors were unlocked. The keys hung from the ignition. Eleanor's purse sat on the passenger seat, her wallet inside containing her driver's license, medical license, credit cards, and $83 in cash. Her medical bag was on the back seat, its contents undisturbed. Stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, various medications, syringes, all the tools of her profession. There were no signs of struggle inside the vehicle, no blood, no torn upholstery, no indication of violence. The car simply looked as if someone had parked it and walked away. The crime scene technicians processed Eleanor's Oldsmobile with meticulous care, photographing it from every angle before beginning their detailed examination. They dusted for fingerprints on the exterior and interior surfaces, finding primarily Eleanor's own prints, which Sheriff Brennan had obtained from items in her house for comparison. They also found several partial prints that didn't match Eleanor's, but these could have come from anyone who'd touched the car in innocent circumstances: gas station attendants, people who'd brushed against it in a parking lot. The prints were catalogued for future comparison if a suspect emerged. Detective Reeves walked the perimeter of the scene, studying the ground for tire tracks or footprints. The soil was hard-packed and dry, baked by weeks of relentless sun, making it difficult to identify useful impressions. He found what might have been tracks from another vehicle, wider than the Oldsmobile's tires, suggesting a truck or SUV, but the impressions were too degraded to cast or photograph with any certainty. The two-track road that led to the homestead saw occasional use by ranchers checking this section of the Dietrich property, so determining which tracks were relevant would be nearly impossible. Inside the abandoned house, Detective Vaughn found evidence that someone had been there recently. In what had once been the kitchen, now open to the sky with most of the roof collapsed, there were fresh scuff marks in the dust on the floor and several cigarette butts that appeared only days old. The brand was Marlboro, one of the most common cigarettes in America, which would make tracing them to a specific individual challenging. She bagged the butts carefully for lab analysis, hoping DNA might still be present if the smoker had left saliva on the filters. The search for Eleanor herself now focused on the immediate area around the homestead. If she'd been brought here, voluntarily or otherwise, she might still be nearby. Sheriff Brennan called in additional search teams, including tracking dogs from the state prison system. By late Tuesday afternoon, 20 people were combing through the coulees and sagebrush flats surrounding the old homestead, calling Eleanor's name, looking for any sign of where she might have gone. The tracking dogs arrived at dusk. 2 German shepherds and their handlers, both corrections officers who volunteered for search and rescue operations, were given items from Eleanor's house to establish her scent. The dogs immediately became agitated when they reached Eleanor's car, confirming she'd been in or near the vehicle recently. They circled the homestead, noses to the ground, then headed north toward a line of sandstone cliffs about half a mile away. The handlers followed, along with Sheriff Brennan, the detectives, and several deputies, their flashlights cutting through the gathering darkness. The terrain grew rougher as they walked, transitioning from prairie grass to eroded badlands cut with deep ravines. Juniper trees clustered in the draws, their twisted branches creating pockets of deep shadow. The dogs led them to the base of the cliffs, where a game trail wound between boulders and scrub vegetation, then stopped at a dense thicket of juniper and wild rose bushes. One dog began barking insistently, the other sat down and whined. The handlers exchanged glances. They knew what this behavior meant. Sheriff Brennan pushed through the thorny branches, his flashlight held high. The beam illuminated the depression first, then what lay within it. He stopped abruptly, his breath catching in his throat. "Here!" he called out, his voice tight. "I found her!" Eleanor's body lay partially concealed by fallen branches that appeared to have been deliberately arranged over her. She was on her back, her eyes closed, her face peaceful. She wore the same clothing Patricia Holbrook had seen her wearing Friday evening: white blouse, navy skirt, medical jacket. Her hands were folded across her chest in an almost ceremonial position. But what made Sheriff Brennan take an involuntary step backward were the marks on her exposed skin. Her arms, visible where the sleeves of her blouse were rolled to the elbows, bore strange symbols, precise geometric patterns carved into her flesh. More symbols were visible on her collarbone, where her blouse had been unbuttoned slightly, and when Sheriff Brennan carefully turned her head, he saw additional markings on the back of her neck. Detective Vaughn joined him, her professionalism overriding the shock that tightened her features. She documented the scene with her camera, the flash freezing Eleanor's body in harsh white light against the darkness. The symbols were unlike anything Vaughan had seen in 15 years of investigating homicides. They weren't random violence or rage-fueled mutilation. They were deliberate, methodical, carved with precision that suggested knowledge of anatomy and comfort with cutting human flesh. The crime scene team worked through the night, setting up lights powered by a portable generator they'd brought on the back of a pickup truck. They photographed everything from multiple angles, then carefully searched the surrounding area for evidence, footprints, discarded items, anything that might identify the killer. The medical examiner, Dr. Vincent Torres, drove from Billings, arriving at 3 in the morning to make a preliminary assessment before Eleanor's body could be transported. Dr. Torres was in his early 60s, a veteran of countless crime scenes who maintained his composure through professional detachment. He examined Eleanor by flashlight and battery-powered lamps, his gloved hands gentle despite the clinical nature of his work. He noted immediately that rigor mortis was well established, suggesting death had occurred at least 2 to 3 days earlier, which aligned with her Friday evening disappearance. The ambient temperature and the partial shade provided by the juniper trees made estimating time of death more precise than it would have been in direct sunlight. The symbols were made post-mortem, Dr. Torres said, straightening up and addressing Sheriff Brennan and the detectives. You can tell by the lack of vital response. No bleeding, no bruising around the incisions. He cut her after she was already dead. He, Detective Reeves asked. Manner of speaking, Dr. Torres acknowledged. Could be a woman, though statistically less likely. The depth and precision of the cuts suggest someone comfortable with sharp instruments, possibly medical training, and enough physical strength to control the blade confidently. These aren't hesitant marks. They're executed with certainty. What about cause of death? Sheriff Brennan asked. Dr. Torres pointed to a small mark on Eleanor's left arm, barely visible in the artificial light. There's a puncture wound here, consistent with an injection. I won't know for certain until I get her back to Billings and do a full autopsy, but based on the lack of other trauma and the peaceful position of the body, I'd hypothesize she was killed with some kind of injection. Potassium chloride is common because it's hard to detect, causes cardiac arrest, and is readily available to anyone with medical access. Eleanor's body was carefully placed in a body bag and transported to Billings for autopsy. Sheriff Brennan remained at the scene until dawn, sitting on a boulder and watching the sun rise over the Badlands, painting the eroded cliffs in shades of orange and red. He'd known Eleanor for 3 years, had trusted her with his wife's medical care, had shared meals and conversations with her. Now she was dead, murdered in a methodical and bizarre fashion that suggested her killer had specific reasons for everything: the location, the method, and especially the symbols. The autopsy confirmed Dr. Torres's preliminary assessment. Eleanor Marsh had died from cardiac arrest induced by an injection of potassium chloride, which had been administered into her left arm. The injection site showed slight bruising consistent with the needle being inserted while she was still alive, but there were no defensive wounds on her hands or arms, suggesting she'd been somehow restrained or incapacitated during the injection. Toxicology found trace amounts of midazolam, a benzodiazepine used for sedation, in her system, which explained the lack of struggle. She'd been drugged, then killed, then the symbols had been carved into her skin within a few hours of death, while the tissues were still pliable. The symbols themselves became the investigation's primary focus. Detective Vaughan had them photographed in high resolution and sent copies to experts across the country: linguists, anthropologists, cryptographers, art historians, anyone who might recognize the patterns or provide insight into their meaning. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit received a full case file, including crime scene photos and background information on Eleanor's life and the threatening letters she'd received. The symbols were geometric, circles within circles, triangles intersecting with straight lines, dots arranged in specific patterns. They covered Eleanor's forearms, her collarbone area, and the back of her neck, approximately 30 individual marks in total. They showed no resemblance to any known alphabet, no connection to gang symbols or occult imagery that any expert could identify. Several academics suggested they might be a personal code, created specifically for this crime and meaningful only to the killer, and perhaps to Eleanor herself, assuming she'd known why she was being targeted. Detective Reeves focused his investigation on Eleanor's past, particularly her time at Capital District Psychiatric Center in Albany, New York. He contacted the hospital administration and requested access to records from Eleanor's employment period, 1974 through 1979. The hospital was initially reluctant, citing patient confidentiality and the age of the records, but a court order from a Montana judge, supported by similar orders from New York, eventually compelled cooperation. What Detective Reeves discovered in those records would transform the investigation and reveal connections that reached back nearly a decade, connecting Eleanor's murder to events and people she'd tried desperately to leave behind. The records from Capital District Psychiatric Center painted a picture of a controversial research program that had operated in the late 1970s under the direction of Dr. Marcus Holling, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma treatment. Eleanor had been one of 7 key staff members involved in the program, which focused on developing techniques for suppressing traumatic memories in patients suffering from severe PTSD, primarily Vietnam veterans who were struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. The research had been funded by a combination of federal grants and pharmaceutical company money, with the stated goal of finding more effective treatments for trauma-induced mental illness. Detective Reeves read through the documentation with growing unease. The research protocols, even to his non-medical eyes, seemed to push ethical boundaries. Patients had been administered experimental combinations of drugs, benzodiazepines, barbiturates and other compounds, while undergoing intensive therapy sessions designed to access and reprogram traumatic memories. The theoretical foundation was that if the emotional content of traumatic memories could be separated from the factual content, patients could remember events without experiencing the debilitating psychological effects. The program had run for approximately 3 years before being quietly shut down in 1978. The official reason, according to administrative memos, was insufficient funding and mixed results. But Detective Reeves found references to ethical complaints filed by junior staff members, concerns about patient consent procedures, and allegations that some patients had experienced severe adverse reactions to the experimental treatments. One internal memo, dated September 1978 and written by a hospital administrator, recommended terminating the program immediately and sealing all records to avoid potential liability. Eleanor Marsh, then Eleanor Whitfield, had been the head psychiatric nurse on the program. Her husband, James Whitfield, had been one of the researchers working alongside Dr. Holling. Of the other 5 key personnel, Detective Reeves was able to identify and locate 4: Dr. Richard Pemberton, now living in Seattle and working in private practice; Dr. Ann Morrison, working at a veterans hospital in Phoenix; Dr. Carl Weber, retired and living in Vermont; and Janet Stroud, a psychiatric nurse who'd left the field and was now teaching high school in Pennsylvania. The 5th team member, a research assistant named Thomas Keller, had died in 1982 from pneumonia. Detective Reeves began making phone calls, explaining that he was investigating Eleanor Marsh's murder and needed to ask questions about the research program at Capital District. The reactions were uniformly defensive. "Doctor," Pemberton hung up after saying he had nothing to discuss. Dr. Morrison insisted she'd only been peripherally involved and knew nothing relevant. Dr. Webber said the research had been legitimate and properly conducted, with full patient consent, and any problems had been exaggerated by people who didn't understand the work. Janet Stroud was the only one who seemed genuinely shaken by Eleanor's death, her voice trembling as she expressed condolences and admitted she'd often wondered if someone would come seeking revenge for what had been done. "Revenge for what?" Detective Reeves asked. "We hurt people," Janet said quietly. "We told ourselves we were helping, that the patients had volunteered, that the potential benefits outweighed the risks. But some of those men, the treatments made them worse, not better. There were memory losses beyond what we'd intended, personality changes, one patient who became violent. We were experimenting on damaged people, and when things went wrong, the program just shut down and we all scattered. No follow-up care, no accountability." Detective Reeves asked if she knew of anyone connected to the program who might hold a grudge strong enough to kill. Janet mentioned that several patients had filed lawsuits in the early 1980s, seeking damages for alleged harm caused by the experimental treatments. The lawsuits had been settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements, but Janet remembered the names of two patients in particular who'd been especially angry: Robert Finch and David Garrett. The name David Garrett stopped Detective Reeves cold. That was the name of the mysterious patient who'd seen Eleanor on the day of her disappearance, providing false contact information. He asked Janet to describe Garrett. She remembered him as being in his mid-30s when he'd been a patient, so he'd be in his mid-40s now, medium height, brown hair, a veteran who'd served in Vietnam and had been struggling with severe PTSD and violent nightmares. The treatments had caused him to lose significant portions of his memory, including memories of his family and childhood. When he'd realized what had been done to him, he'd been enraged, threatening legal action, and, according to rumors Janet had heard, making direct threats against Dr. Holling and other staff members. Detective Reeves contacted the New York State Police and requested records of the lawsuits and any associated criminal complaints. While waiting for those records, he drove to Seattle to interview Dr. Richard Pemberton in person, believing the psychiatrist would be harder to dismiss in a face-to-face conversation. Dr. Pemberton lived in a modern townhouse in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, an affluent area with views of downtown Seattle. He answered the door reluctantly, his expression guarded. Pemberton was in his late 50s, grey-haired and fit, dressed casually in khakis and a polo shirt. He led Detective Reeves to a study lined with medical texts and file cabinets. When Reeves began asking about the research program, Pemberton cut him off. "I've spent nearly a decade trying to distance myself from that disaster," Pemberton said. "I was young, ambitious, and I thought we were doing groundbreaking work. Dr. Holling was charismatic and convincing, and the potential applications seemed revolutionary. But the execution was flawed, and yes, patients were harmed. I've made my peace with that through professional growth and ethical re-education. I have nothing more to say." "Eleanor Marsh was murdered," Detective Reeves said. "Someone killed her in a very specific way, drugging her, injecting her with potassium chloride, then carving symbols into her body after death. This suggests a killer with medical knowledge and a deep personal grudge. I need to know if any patients from the program threatened violence." Pemberton's face paled slightly. He was silent for a long moment, then nodded. "There were threats," he admitted. "After the lawsuits, after the settlements, there were letters and phone calls. Dr. Holling bore the brunt of it because he was the program director, but Eleanor received threats too, and so did James Whitfield before he died. David Garrett was the most persistent. He'd show up at the hospital demanding to speak with someone, demanding answers about why his memories were gone. Security eventually banned him from the property. "Did you ever feel personally threatened?" Reeves asked. "Yes," Pemberton said. "I received letters similar to what you described finding in Eleanor's house. Vague threats, references to debts being paid. The last one I received was about 6 months ago. I reported it to the Seattle police, but they said without specific threats or evidence of immediate danger, there wasn't much they could do. I've been careful, security system, unlisted address, varying my routines, but I've been waiting for something to happen." Detective Reeves asked Pemberton about Dr. Marcus Holling, the program director. Pemberton explained that Holling had left Capital District shortly after the program shut down, moving to private practice in Albany. In 1978, 9 years earlier, Holling had disappeared under circumstances eerily similar to Eleanor's. His car had been found abandoned on a rural road outside Albany. His body was discovered 3 weeks later in a wooded area, dead from what the medical examiner determined was an injection-induced cardiac arrest. And his body had been marked with carved symbols, different symbols than those found on Eleanor, but the pattern of the crime was nearly identical. This information hit Detective Reeves like a physical blow. He'd been investigating Eleanor's murder as an isolated crime, but now it appeared to be part of a series with potentially more victims. He immediately contacted Detective Vaughn back in Montana to share what he'd learned, then drove directly to the Seattle Police Department to request copies of their files on any threats reported by Dr. Pemberton. Meanwhile, in Montana, Detective Vaughn was pursuing the David Garrett angle. The name was common enough to generate thousands of hits in national databases, but when she narrowed the search to men aged 40 to 50 with connections to Albany, New York, and possible military service, the list shortened considerably. She found a David Michael Garrett who matched the approximate age and who had a documented history of threatening behavior, though no convictions. His last known address was in Forsyth, Montana, the town Garrett had claimed as his residence when registering at Eleanor's clinic. Vaughn drove to Forsyth, a small town on the Yellowstone River, about 60 miles west of Miles City. She located the address Garrett had provided, a rundown apartment building on the edge of town. The landlord, an elderly man named Frank Sutton, confirmed that a David Garrett had rented an apartment there for 6 months, from January through June 1987, paying in cash each month. Garrett had given almost no personal information, claiming to be a traveling construction worker. He'd kept to himself, rarely seen by other tenants, and had moved out in late June without providing forwarding information. Frank provided a description that matched the vague details from Eleanor's receptionist. Medium height, brown hair, probably mid-40s, nothing particularly distinctive about his appearance. He usually wore work clothes, jeans, flannel shirts, work boots. He drove an older pickup truck, possibly a Chevy from the early 1980s, dark blue or black. Frank couldn't remember the license plate. Vaughn searched Garrett's former apartment, now rented to a new tenant, but found nothing useful. She interviewed neighboring tenants, but none had interacted with Garrett beyond occasional nods in the hallway. One woman remembered seeing him late at night sometimes, sitting in his truck in the parking lot, just sitting there in the darkness for hours. Another recalled hearing him on the phone once, his voice raised in anger, though she couldn't make out the words. The investigation intensified as the connections became clearer. David Garrett, a patient damaged by Eleanor's research program, had been living within 60 miles of Miles City for 6 months leading up to her murder. He'd seen her as a patient under a false name just hours before she disappeared. He'd been sending threatening letters for months, possibly years. And the method of murder, the precise medical knowledge required, the symbolic mutilation, suggested someone intimately familiar with the research that had harmed him, someone recreating the clinical detachment with which he'd been treated, turning the methodology back on those who'd applied it to him. The FBI's involvement brought additional resources to the investigation. Special Agent Elizabeth Chen, based in the Bureau's Helena office, coordinated with Detective Vaughan and Detective Reeves to build a comprehensive profile of David Garrett and to track his movements over the past decade. Chen specialized in serial violent offenders, and the pattern emerging from the Holling and Marsh murders suggested they were dealing with someone who'd been planning revenge for years, methodically researching his targets, establishing their locations, and executing carefully premeditated attacks. The Albany Police Department reopened the 1978 investigation into Dr. Marcus Holling's murder, providing their complete case file to the FBI. The similarities were striking and disturbing. Holling had disappeared on a Wednesday evening in November 1978, his car found abandoned 2 days later on a rural road outside the city. His body was discovered 3 weeks later in a dense section of the Adirondack foothills, hidden in a depression beneath a fallen tree. He'd been dead for approximately 3 days after his disappearance, killed by an injection of what forensic testing suggested was potassium chloride, though the technology available in 1978 had been less precise than current methods. The symbols carved into his body, on his arms, chest, and face had never been deciphered, and the case had gone cold after months of investigation yielded no viable suspects. At the time, David Garrett had been questioned as a matter of routine since he'd filed a lawsuit against Holling and the hospital. Garrett had an alibi for the period of Holling's disappearance. He'd been in a veterans rehabilitation facility in Massachusetts, documented by staff and fellow patients. The alibi had been verified, and Garrett had been eliminated as a suspect. Now, nearly a decade later, investigators wondered if the alibi had been fabricated, or if Garrett had accomplices who'd committed the murder while he maintained his distance. Special Agent Chen ordered a nationwide search for David Garrett's whereabouts, flagging his name in databases and alerting law enforcement agencies across the country. She also contacted the Department of Veterans Affairs to obtain Garrett's military records and medical files, seeking any information that might help predict his behavior or identify people he might contact for support. The military records revealed that David Michael Garrett had served in the Marine Corps from 1968 to 1971, including 2 tours in Vietnam. He'd been decorated for valor, but had also received disciplinary action for unauthorized violence against civilians during a village search operation in 1970. After discharge, he'd struggled with civilian life, experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, and violent outbursts. He'd been admitted to Capital District Psychiatric Center in 1976 as a voluntary patient seeking treatment for what was then called post-Vietnam syndrome and later recognized as PTSD. According to the medical files, Garrett had participated in Dr. Holling's research program for approximately 18 months, undergoing regular treatments involving drug therapy and intensive counseling sessions. The treatments had initially seemed promising, reducing the frequency of his nightmares and flashbacks. But after 6 months, staff noted concerning side effects. Garrett was experiencing significant memory loss, extending beyond the traumatic combat memories the treatment was designed to suppress. He couldn't recall large portions of his childhood, his relationships with family members, his life before Vietnam. When he'd complained and tried to withdraw from the program, he was told the memory loss was temporary and would resolve with time. It hadn't resolved. By the time the research program was shut down in 1978, Garrett's memory impairment was permanent. He'd lost his connection to his own past, his sense of identity, the continuity that defines a human life. The lawsuit he'd filed sought damages for medical malpractice and negligent harm, claiming the research team had failed to properly inform him of the risks and had continued treatments despite obvious adverse effects. The hospital had settled out of court in 1982 for an undisclosed sum, with Garrett signing a non-disclosure agreement that prevented him from publicly discussing the case. But money couldn't restore what had been taken from him, and the settlement clearly hadn't brought him peace. The threatening letters that Eleanor and other program members had received suggested Garrett had spent years nursing his rage, planning his revenge, waiting for the right moment to exact justice as he saw it. Detective Reeves contacted Garrett's family members, hoping they might know his current location or be able to provide insight into his state of mind. Garrett's mother had died in 1985. His father, living in a nursing home in Connecticut, had advanced dementia and couldn't provide useful information. Garrett had a younger sister, Michelle, who lived in Portland, Oregon. When Reeves called her, she was initially defensive but eventually agreed to speak with him. Michelle Garrett had last seen her brother in 1983, she told Reeves. After the lawsuit settlement, David had withdrawn from the family, angry that they didn't understand what had been done to him, frustrated that they expected him to move on from something that had destroyed his life. He'd written her a letter in 1984, postmarked from somewhere in Wyoming, saying he was trying to find peace, but that certain debts still needed to be paid. Michelle hadn't heard from him since. Did he ever mention specific people he blamed for what happened? Reeves asked. Dr. Holling was always the main one, Michelle said. David called him a butcher who'd experimented on vulnerable people for grant money and career advancement. But he also mentioned a nurse named Eleanor, said she'd been present during every treatment session, that she'd held him down when the drugs made him confused and combative. He felt betrayed by her because nurses are supposed to protect patients, not help hurt them. The pieces of the puzzle were assembling into a clear picture. David Garrett had killed Dr. Holling in 1978, despite having an alibi that investigators at the time had considered solid. He'd then spent nearly a decade tracking the other members of the research team, learning their locations, planning his approach. He'd moved to Forsyth in early 1987, establishing a base from which he could watch Eleanor Marsh and prepare for the moment when he'd confront her. But questions remained. What did the symbols mean? Why carve them post-mortem? Was Garrett's work finished with Eleanor's death, or were other former team members in danger? Dr. Pemberton in Seattle was placed under protective surveillance, with Seattle police conducting regular patrols past his home and workplace. Dr. Ann Morrison in Phoenix was similarly warned and offered protection, which she accepted. Dr. Carl Weber in Vermont initially refused protection, but agreed to report any suspicious activity. Janet Stroud in Pennsylvania requested and received local police monitoring. Special Agent Chen consulted with behavioral psychologists and psychiatrists to better understand Garrett's likely mindset and motivations. The consensus was that he was unlikely to stop until all those he held responsible had been punished. The symbols probably represented something specific to Garrett, perhaps a code relating to the research protocols or a representation of the damage done to his memory, or symbols from experiences he could no longer remember. Without capturing Garrett and interviewing him, decoding the symbols would remain speculative. A break in the case came in mid-September, 6 weeks after Eleanor's murder. A highway patrol officer in Wyoming stopped a pickup truck for a broken taillight outside the town of Sheridan. The driver's license identified him as Daniel Green, but the officer's instincts suggested something was off about the man's demeanor. Nervous, evasive, careful not to make direct eye contact, the officer ran the license plate and found it didn't match the registration on file. He detained the driver and called for backup. When investigators searched the truck, they found a storage compartment behind the seat containing medical supplies, syringes, vials of midazolam and potassium chloride, surgical scalpels, latex gloves. They also found a notebook filled with handwritten notes, Names, addresses, detailed schedules of daily routines. Among the names were Richard Pemberton, Anne Morrison, Carl Weber, and Janet Stroud. There were also notes about their security arrangements when they came and went from their homes, where they were most vulnerable. The driver was taken into custody and fingerprinted. His prints matched David Michael Garrett's military records. He'd been living under the alias Daniel Green, with forged identification documents, traveling between western states while surveilling his targets. In the truck's glove compartment, they found maps with routes marked between Montana, Washington, Arizona, Vermont, and Pennsylvania, a road trip of revenge that would have claimed 4 more lives if he hadn't been stopped. David Garrett's arrest brought relief to the surviving members of Dr. Holling's research team, but provided no immediate answers about the symbols or the full extent of his crimes. Garrett was extradited to Montana, where he would face charges for Eleanor Marsh's murder. The physical evidence linking him to the crime was substantial. His medical supplies matched those used to kill Eleanor. His notebook contained detailed surveillance information about her routines. His truck, when processed by forensic technicians, yielded fiber evidence consistent with materials found at the abandoned homestead where Eleanor's car had been discovered. But Garrett refused to speak. From the moment of his arrest, through his arraignment, and the months of pre-trial preparation, he maintained complete silence. He wouldn't answer questions, wouldn't acknowledge investigators or attorneys, wouldn't defend himself or offer any explanation for his actions. He sat in the Yellowstone County Jail, staring at the walls of his cell, unreachable, locked inside whatever remained of his fractured mind. The trial began in February 1988, 6 months after Eleanor's murder. The prosecution, led by Montana Assistant Attorney General David Foster, presented overwhelming evidence of Garrett's guilt. His presence in Eleanor's clinic under a false name hours before she disappeared, his threatening letters found in her home, his notebook detailing her schedule, the medical supplies in his truck matching those used to kill her, forensic evidence placing his truck at the abandoned homestead. The case was methodical, comprehensive, and devastating. The defense appointed public defenders who'd done their best with an uncooperative client argued that Garrett's mental state, the damage done by the very research program Eleanor had helped conduct, made him legally insane and unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions. They brought in psychiatric experts who testified about the profound psychological trauma of losing one's memories, the identity dissolution that could result from having your past erased, the rage that could fester when the medical establishment you'd trusted had instead violated that trust fundamentally. The prosecution countered with their own experts, arguing that Garrett's actions demonstrated clear planning and rational decision-making inconsistent with legal insanity. He'd maintained false identities, conducted long-term surveillance, acquired specific medical knowledge and supplies, and executed his plans with precision. These weren't the actions of someone unable to understand right from wrong. They were the actions of someone who understood perfectly well but had chosen revenge over lawfulness. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On February 23rd, they returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Garrett showed no reaction when the verdict was read, staring straight ahead with the same blank expression he'd maintained throughout the trial. At sentencing, Judge Margaret Sullivan gave him life imprisonment without possibility of parole, noting the premeditated nature of the crime and the likelihood that he would have killed additional victims if he hadn't been apprehended. Even after conviction, Garrett never spoke about the symbols or confirmed his involvement in Dr. Holling's murder. The Albany case remained officially unsolved, though most investigators believed Garrett was responsible and that his 1978 alibi had somehow been fabricated or mistaken. Without a confession or additional evidence, closing that case was impossible. Sheriff Thomas Brennan attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back row and watching the man who'd murdered a woman he'd considered a friend. He'd hoped the trial would provide closure, answers. Something that would let him believe there'd been purpose in the sleepless nights and the years of doubt. But as the gavel struck for the final time, Brennan realized there would be no such peace. The courtroom was silent, except for the shuffle of papers and the distant hum of air conditioning, a hollow sound that seemed to echo the emptiness left behind by the murder. For Eleanor, there would never be justice deep enough to compensate for the fear she must have felt in her final moments, or the years she had spent trying to build a life far from the ghosts of her past. After the sentencing, a brief quiet settled over Miles City. The media attention faded, and the town's routines gradually reasserted themselves, but scars remained. The clinic reopened under a new doctor that spring, and the residents did their best not to mention Eleanor's name in casual conversation anymore. The white clapboard house on Strevel Avenue stood empty for nearly 2 years. The windows gathered dust, paint peeled, and the front steps sagged from disrepair. A for sale sign tilted in the dry wind, until one day it wasn't there anymore. By then, the grass had taken over the walkway completely. Sheriff Brennan retired shortly after Garrett's conviction. The case had consumed too much of him. He'd spent nights replaying every decision, every moment when perhaps something else could have been done. He moved with his wife to Billings to be closer to their son, but everyone knew the real reason was that he needed distance from the town where Eleanor's ghost still lingered. Brennan spent his last years quietly, gardening in the warmer months, reading in the afternoons, occasionally receiving letters from Detective Vaughan and Reeves, who'd both stayed in law enforcement and gone on to head major investigations for the state. Vaughan's letters were steady and concise. She never forgot the details. Reeves's were more philosophical. He confessed that certain cases never leave you even when justice is technically served. Brennan understood that better than anyone. Garrett served out his life sentence in Deer Lodge Prison under high security. Despite multiple psychiatric evaluations, he never broke his silence. Some doctors suggested he suffered from a combination of PTSD and identity fragmentation from his memory loss. Others believed his silence was intentional, a final act of control in a life defined by violation. He refused visitors, including his public defenders and the occasional journalist seeking an interview about the infamous Symbol murders. He died in 1999 after collapsing in the prison yard during morning exercise. The autopsy revealed heart failure, unrelated to any violence or abuse. He was buried in a state cemetery, his grave marked only by a number. But the end of his life didn't end the questions. After his death, investigators catalogued the personal items he'd kept in his cell. Among them was a small, tattered notebook, the same kind that had once contained lists of names and addresses. Most of its pages were covered with rough sketches of geometric shapes, circles intersecting triangles, lines repeating at measured intervals, dots forming mirrored sequences. They resembled the carvings that had been found on Eleanor's body and, decades earlier, on Dr. Holling's. On the final page, written carefully and clearly, was a single line: "Memory is not erased, it's rewritten." And the state archivists in Helena secured the notebook with the other case materials, stored in the same evidence boxes that contained the photographs and reports from Eleanor's murder. Scholars have examined those symbols countless times since, each coming away with a different theory. Some argue that the patterns encode fragments of technical research notes, the remnants of Garrett's damaged memory reorganized into form. Others think the marks were meant as a confession written in code, a surgeon's shorthand for what had been taken from him. No one can say for certain. The meaning remains just beyond reach, as if Garrett had ensured that even in death, only he could understand fully. In 1998, a few months before Garrett's passing, Detective Vaughan drove from Helena to visit Sheriff Brennan in Billings. He'd been in declining health, but when she arrived, he was awake and alert, sitting on the porch with a wool blanket over his knees. They talked for hours about cases, about how some people can move past tragedy, and others seem permanently caught in its orbit. When their conversation turned to Eleanor, Vaughan shared something she hadn't told the press, or even the district attorney. "Do you remember the last letter we found? The one Garrett sent her in July?" she asked. "It said, 'I'm coming for you soon.' Well, we recovered ink impressions beneath that message when the lab used infrared light. It looks like he'd written another sentence first, then erased it or scraped it away." Brennan frowned. "What did it say?" Vaughan's voice softened. "It said, 'You did this to me once. Now I return the favor.'" Brennan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He wanted her to understand before he did it." "Maybe," Vaughan replied. "Or maybe he wanted to make sure nobody ever understood anything again." When Vaughan left that evening, the sun was setting over the city, the horizon painted in dusty gold. Brennan watched until her car disappeared down the road, then turned back to his house, the old ache of unsolved questions pressing at his ribs. He died the following spring, sitting in that same chair, the newspaper folded open beside him to an article about new forensic DNA methods solving decades-old crimes. But none of those tools, no matter how advanced, would ever uncover what Garrett's symbols meant, or why Eleanor Marsh had believed she could outrun her past by moving to the wide loneliness of Montana in the first place. Years later, the story resurfaced in true crime documentaries and at university lectures about behavioral pathology. People debated whether Garrett was a victim or a monster, whether the experiments done in the name of science could ever justify their results. Some speculated that Eleanor's own guilt had drawn her to desolate places like Miles City, where no one knew her history. Others said it didn't matter. No one deserved what happened to her. The only thing that seemed universally agreed upon was that both killer and victim had been shaped by the same tragedy, the dangerous belief that the human mind can be cleanly edited, that memories and conscience are separate things. The clinic on Main Street was eventually remodeled into a wellness center, the kind that sold aromatherapy and massage therapy instead of prescriptions. A new generation of residents passed the building every day, unaware of what had transpired there decades earlier. Only the oldest locals remembered the summer of 1987, when the town's sense of safety dissolved into dry Montana dust. They spoke of it rarely, and when they did, their tones lowered, as though speaking might stir something best left settled. In the archives of the Montana Department of Justice, locked away in Box 2314E, the photographs of Eleanor Marsh still rest beside Garrett's final notebook, labeled and cross-referenced for future study. Every few years, a criminology student requests access to examine the patterns again, hoping to find what hundreds before them could not. They pin the photographs to corkboards, draw connections with string, decode and translate, run algorithms and pattern analysis, but the meaning always slips away. And so the case of the Montana disappearance of 1987 endures, not just as the story of a murder solved, but as an enigma that refuses to yield all its truths. Eleanor's name appears on the town's memorial plaque for victims of unsolved crimes, even though her killer was caught and convicted. It remains there because no one, not even those who studied it for decades, ever truly solved the puzzle carved into her skin. Some mysteries aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to remind us of the limits of understanding, the fragility of conscience, and the thin line between those who heal and those who harm. And somewhere out on the plains east of Miles City, if you stand in the wind long enough, it still carries faint echoes of that summer, the hum of insects, the chirp of distant birds, and something else beneath it, quieter, like a question that's been waiting all these years for an answer that will never come.